I'd like to tell a story, but it's such a big story that I don't possibly have the time to tell it. So I have to cut it down. And when you make a story, a good long story, shorter, it's hard to know which parts to condense. This story started hundreds of years ago. And the way it was handed down to us is that the great Master Jesus Christ appeared to the great Master Babaji in the Himalayas and said, look, Jesus said, my disciples are doing well, they're doing good works, but they've forgotten inner communion. They've forgotten how to commune with infinite spirit. We need to send someone to reawaken the path of inner communion, the path of Sanatana Dharma. And because of that, I want to call it a conversation. I'm not sure Babaji and Jesus Christ exactly how they conversed. It's hard to imagine them sitting down with a teacup and going, well, what do you think? Shall we send somebody down to Earth to fix things up a little bit? So, however that took place, the result of it was that Lahiri Mahashaya was sent to reawaken the teaching of Kriya Yoga. And this great teaching, it's hard for us to quite imagine, but Lahiri Mahashaya initiated over 100,000 people into Kriya. Based on that, you'd think, well, there must be a lot of advanced Kriya bonds from, and lineages from his teaching, but as far as we know, there really aren't that many who took up the responsibility and the inspiration to carry on his work. There are some, but there are not that many. And of course, one of his chief disciples, Swami Sri Yukteswar, his role wasn't so much to bring, to have many disciples himself, but he, by the way he put it was, by training Yogananda, he brought millions of people to the path. His main responsibility was to train Yogananda to come to the West. And as Yogananda put it, when talking about his master, Sri Yukteswar, he said, by changing me, he's changed millions. This is how the great teachings of India have been passed on through the millennium. Not through books, but from guru to disciple. And the disciple then takes on the responsibility to continue the teachings and the blessings of their guru. And so it's only practical and within the framework of this ancient tradition that Yogananda would have disciples who would carry on his work. But if we look at history, we find that the spreading of the teachers of a great master don't generally come from a large group of people. They come from one or two individuals. And whether we would want it to be so or not, the truth is that after the passing of a great master, the disciples, they don't always get along all that well. And it makes you scratch your head, but nevertheless it's true. So Buddha's disciples created different paths of Buddhism, and Christ's disciples went out and created different paths of Christianity. And so it is that Master's disciples haven't always gotten along as well as we would have hoped. But I have to say, regardless of the problems on the surface, I have to say that Master did have many great disciples that were part of the Self-Realization Fellowship and YSS. It's hard for us to understand why these challenges, these human interactions that seem contrary to the spirit of the spiritual life, how they can take place. How is it that truly great and loving disciples don't always get along? But the fact is that when even a great master takes on a form, once you take on the human form and you begin to live in the mud puddle that we call planet Earth, you get a little muddy. Not on the inside, but on the outside. What's on the outside? The personality. So we know from the autobiography of a yogi that Sri Yukteswar, who was an avatar, had a disagreement with Babaji. And we go, how could that be? And Master had disagreements with Sri Yukteswar. Master left the ashram and went up to the Himalayas for longer than we really realized. In our human side, Maya will look at this and say to us, well, see what a whole fake the whole thing is. These great masters can't even get along all the time. They must be fake. But what we have to realize is that as in all of life, there's something else going on underneath. And we need to look underneath the surface of life, not only in others, but in ourselves, in order to discern exactly what's going on. Because you meet people, you're going down the street, you meet somebody, they seem grumpy. But if you got to know that person, you'd probably find that they also have a very loving side, a humorous side, a compassionate side. Any one point of perception about a person is not going to tell the whole story. There are people who think that Paramahansa Yogananda was just a lucky fellow who met a bunch of great saints and wrote about them. It's hard to imagine that you could meet God in the body and just go, oh, what a pleasant old guy he is. What an interesting character that guy is. Did not recognize that universal presence is manifesting in this being, in your presence. But the truth is that happens all the time. That's happened to all of the masters. They weren't recognized. But in the life of every master, there are those who do recognize who they are. And those people become their disciples. And one such was the man that we know of as Swami Kriyananda. And he wasn't born Swami Kriyananda. He was born J. Donald Walters. Master called him Walter when he came to the ashram. And it makes you laugh. It makes you laugh, Walter. But it was perfect. It was sweet. It was educational. Because when Walter arrived at the ashram, he was feeling his oats. He was a young, intelligent man who thought that he knew quite a bit about modern thought and how philosophies and everything that was going on one level. On the other level, he realized that as well defined his intellect was, he didn't know what was going on from the inside. And it was only when he read the autobiography of a yogi that he recognized that here was someone who knew about life from the inside, who knew what was going on in the deepest sense, the reality of life. And he traveled across the country in order to find this man and unexpectedly say to him, I want to be your disciple. The first words that he said to him, Master said, how can I help you? Can you imagine? You've never met this guy in your life except you read his book and you go, sir, I want to be your disciple. And then one of those picture-perfect moments takes place. Master touched him on the heart, of his heart, and he sent the light into him. And Swamiji describes it that his hand was just shaking. And it was on there for a long time. And from that moment, his life was changed. He went from being a young man who had grown up in the world and society, and he became a disciple. In 2006, Swamiji spoke at the launching of what was called at that time the Material Success Through Yoga Principles course. And during that talk, he slipped slightly in the words that he used. But they were very revealing about what took place from the time that he received Yogananda's blessings until the end of his life. He said, since that time that I came to the ashram and met Yogananda, I have lived with him for over 60 years. And then he said, oh, but by the way, he passed in 1952. It was just a little slip, but it was so revealing. He's lived for over 60 years with Yogananda. The fact that Yogananda had passed out of the physical form was completely immaterial. It was completely beside the point. Because in his heart, in his consciousness, in his daily intents, he had lived with Yogananda. And he had basically taken each and every day of his life and said, sir, what are we going to do today? What am I going to, how can I accomplish this? And he tells the story about the garden party in Beverly Hills that he attended. Master spoke, and there were some 800 people there, and Swamiji and a few of the other disciples were there. And he said it was the most powerful talk that he ever heard Yogananda give. And Yogananda said, youth will go north, south, east, west, everywhere, spreading the spirit of world brotherhood and the ideal of world brotherhood colonies. And Kriyananda in that moment vowed to help to fulfill that prophecy. Master said, my words are registered in the ether. They must come true. And so, from that moment in 1949, Kriyananda didn't know how he could do that. He was in Self-Realization Fellowship when he talked to Dayamata about World Brotherhood Colonies. She said, frankly, I'm not interested. You scratch your head, because that was one of the main ideals that Yogananda had. And I was in Dayamata's presence once, up close, and felt her presence. She was a great soul. I mean, I can't define how great, but all I can say is that she wasn't a nobody. She was a somebody. But she didn't have that job, or she didn't see that as her job. Kriyananda, that was his job. We were talking about Mahatma Gandhi just briefly on the way over here. Mahatma Gandhi had a job. He was born to do what he did. He didn't have another job. So we look at his life and you see, if you were, all the things that took place for him to achieve what he achieved, they all lined up in a row when you look back and you see how the puzzle fit together for that to work so perfectly. And if you read the New Path, you see how all of those things lined up for Kriyananda to accomplish what he accomplished. But he had to choose it. We all have choices that we make in life, and they are driven by our past karma. But there is a point of reality in which we live where we can change our karma if we choose to. we can make that pivotal action that, like Kriyananda did, because he could have read the book and gone home and thought about it. But clearly he was compelled to act. But we must follow through on that feeling that we have in relationship to our spiritual life. Since Swamiji's passing, on the Ananda, the American Ananda.org website, people have been posting condolences and thoughts, expressions of love, caring, stories of how they were influenced by Kriyanandaji's life. And there is a theme. The last time I looked, there was over 400 posts. And each and every one of these people who posted, whether they had never met Swamiji before, had just only come into contact with his books or his music relatively recently, or whether they'd been associated with him for over 40 years, they all had been touched to the core of their being, and that this was to them, in essence, the most dear soul that they had ever come into contact with. That their association with him, not in his body necessarily, although might have been, but that connection, that inner influence, was the most influencing and, in almost every case, life-saving. That point in your life which you turn from thinking that the world is just a bundle of trouble and you have nothing but suffering, to finding that there is such a thing as peace, that there is such a thing as joy, that there is a positive purpose to life, that there's something that you can do with your life that will lead to expanding joy, peace, compassion, love. That there is a way to touch spirit in our lives and have that spill out into everything that we do. Hope. We suddenly have hope. All of these people. And it wasn't just because Swamiji was a fantastic storyteller or a great communicator. There was a spirit, a power, a presence that lived through that form. And if you were to choose one line, if I was to choose one line that describes Swamiji's life, I remember hearing him say back in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, I forget exactly when, but it was after this period where, in the 60s there was this great social revolution in America, and everybody was looking for alternatives. And as a part of that search for finding meaning in life and recognizing that society and civilization as we knew it in those modern times didn't have all the answers, we finally recognized as a larger group of people that we needed to question how things were going and seek better solutions. And as soon as people get a little bit of information, suddenly they want to be the educator. They want to, hey, look, I know something. And so gurus were popping up on every street corner, in every different flavor. Some from India, some from America, but just everybody who'd read a book suddenly wanted to be a guru. And Swamiji said, everybody wants to be a guru. I would rather be a good disciple. And to me, this has been the cornerstone of his life. How to be a good disciple. How to live in the spirit of your master and to share that spirit, diminishing yourself. And Swamiji, it was hard for him to diminish. The guy was talented. I mean, what are you going to do? He is a great musician. He's a great author. He's a great speaker. He's a great leader. He's a man with vision. He had a lot to share. But if you, and there's that saying, no man is great to his valet. Because most people, when you get to know them behind the veneer of what they put out, you see that they're just as petty and self-concerned and confused, basically, as every other person. But if you got to know Swamiji closely, you realized that that wasn't true with him. And that the closer you became to him, the more you knew about him, the more you recognized that this man was never different. This man never put on a picture when he was in public, and he was different in private. When you met Swamiji, you met Swamiji. There was only one of him. And in his heart, he was always a disciple. But he had to figure this out, because he had only been a disciple for 3.5 years when Master passed. And then, after committing his whole life to Self-Realization Fellowship, after 14 years, he was booted out on his own. He didn't know what to do with himself. He had never lived as an adult on his own. He was in the monastery. And he was told that he couldn't have anything to do with sharing Master with the world. They just wanted him to disappear. And he had to pick himself up and literally pull himself together, because he was shattered. And it took him some years. It took him about 5 or 6 years to really come to grips with what should he do with his life? How could he be a disciple? And then he at this certain point where every disciple has to come to the point where you stop trying to figure it out for yourself. And you recognize that there is no life experience that you can have that God has not given you. When he wrote to Anandamoy Ma, who he had the good fortune to know and spend some time with, and he told her of what had happened, and she said, "This is Guru's blessing. This calamity, this most unbelievable turn of events in his life was the Guru's blessing." He had a lot of trouble digesting that. But of course, he knew who she was. So he had to consider very seriously. And so he began to turn in his mind that he should be open again. That he had to stop feeling sorry for himself and be the disciple, and to open himself in new and fresh ways to how, if this was a blessing, if God had ordained this to happen, what was supposed to happen next? And as soon as he did that, somebody invited him to speak and to sing. And he refused. But they invited him again. And he refused. And they kept inviting him until finally, how often it is we don't get the message the first time, the second time, the 5th time, the 10th time, until eventually, oh, maybe somebody's trying to tell me something. And of course, as soon as he started to share, he felt that blessing. He went, oh, okay, I am supposed to do this. I can't let anybody else tell me what my discipleship should look like. I have to attune myself directly to my Master, and then through that relationship, manifest the truth as best I can. And then we can look back and see the history of Swamiji's life is that's exactly what he did. He lived his relationship with Master. He lived with Master from the day that he met him, except for those years, and it wasn't that he wasn't living with Master, but what happened is the boat was rocking so much that he was so busy holding on, he couldn't see ahead. But once the boat stopped rocking, then he was, now I can see again. This is a very courageous soul. One of the things you might do if you see some of these slideshows that have been shown, there's a lot of great videos now online of the various ceremonies that have taken place around the world. And one of the slideshows of Swamiji's life, look at the clothing that he wears. I think it's so fascinating. I've always been fascinated by Swamiji, how he lives, and what it feels like underneath. Because if you take a traditional Swami, well, Swamis wear ochre, and that's it. In the morning they wear ochre, in the afternoon they wear ochre, and in the evening they wear ochre. That's it. There's no other thing to wear. But if you look at all these pictures of Swamiji, he wears all kinds of things. Because he never defined his discipleship and his representation of Sanatana Dharma as the clothing that he wears. And in fact, I believe that the fact that he felt so free to express himself in that way was a very essential part of the message that he gave to the world, which is don't be stuck in these old forms that you think represent truth. Respect them according to your nature, according to your culture, as you feel inspired. But don't define your spirituality as the past. Define it as the now, the present. And the truth as it wants to live through your life. We live in a whole new age, Dwapara Yuga. We have to begin to free ourselves from this old way of viewing life and recognize that nature is ever new. That spirit is ever new. So Swamiji never defined himself in the ways that others wanted to define him. That takes courage. And several times in his life, he made decisions and did things that could have cost him his quote-unquote followers. The people who felt, and he did at times do things when people left. He says, well, I can't handle you doing that. I can't see you doing that. Doesn't meet my image of the way I want you to be in order for me to stay connected to you, so they would leave. But he never defined his role in life as being a teacher even. He said, I'm not a teacher. I'm a sharer. I'm going to share with you something that has brought inspiration to me. If you're interested, great. If you're not, God bless you. I hope you find what brings you happiness. He never felt compelled to convince people to believe him. What he basically says, hey, try it. You know, maybe it'll work for you. Give it a shot. And he had such a magnetism as that people were given a hope that it might be true, and they followed him. But you can't just go through the motions. You can't just join a club and be a member of a Sangha and say, okay, I joined in such and such a year, and I went, on Sunday regularly. As many people do, they go, in America, they go to church on Sunday and they put their money in the plate, and they figure, okay, as long as I don't get into too much trouble at the end of life, I'll go to heaven instead of the alternative. This is not the way to live the spiritual life. And so Swamiji had really taken up a huge task, not only to guide his own life through his attunement to his guru, but then to discover what his discipleship should look like in relationship to sharing the teachings. And Swamiji didn't know. Over the years, we've seen him more and more able to grow into his role. He would never say that he was a guru in the early years. Later on, he would resist saying that, but he would acknowledge that God's power flowed through his life. Let others choose how to relate to him. And this is the practical reality. is that we must choose through our interconnection to God and gurus what Swamiji's life means to us and how to stay connected to that meaning. And this is the challenge, now I see a lot of great souls in Ananda Sangha. I see a lot of really, not just the people who are old-timers, but since I've come back to India, I've seen that there's a lot of really sincere souls that have opened themselves up to the spiritual life. And we don't know. It's so easy to say, well, he's been here more years, and they have such and such position, and we don't know the history behind most people's lives. There's many great souls that are just quietly loving God. They don't advertise. And if they don't have the role of serving in the front, it's easy to not recognize them because they're quiet. At Ananda, we've never made, and certainly Swamiji never made, that kind of assessment. And in Master's life, many of the very best disciples were the ones in the back, in the quiet. They weren't the ones in front. Sister Ganamata never spoke publicly, to the best of my knowledge. But she was the foremost woman disciple. Rajarsi Janakananda was never a lecturer. He had a small meditation, can you imagine? So Rajarsi Janakananda, who Master said achieved complete liberation at the end of his life, he had a really small meditation group in Kansas City. Just a handful of people came. Here's a guy who's basically one with God. And I'm sure most of those people didn't realize it. That wasn't his role. That wasn't his job. Each of us must, through our interconnection to God and Guru, figure out what does our discipleship look like, and use Swami Kriyananda's life as a way to springboard, to understand how to approach our own lives, rather than saying, oh, I need to be exactly like Swami Kriyananda. I'm sorry, that isn't going to happen. Trust me, those of us who have been around Swamiji a long time know how hard it is to keep up with Swami. None of us could. Now what I see is a bunch of mini Swamis. Little sparks of some larger thing. But in those sparks, there is that connection. And each of us needs to connect to those connections as we feel inspired. And when I was in Assisi this last week for the funeral service that was held there, and disciples gathered from around the world, this is a family. It's not a club. It's not the army. It's a place where people feel called, and then when you enter into the spirit that we call Ananda, then it's your home. And everybody feels that. And it doesn't matter whether they've been on the path for 5 minutes or 50 years. It doesn't matter what country they're from, what language they speak. There is a communion that takes place. This is spiritual family. And just as it said in the end of Autobiography of a Yogi, Master said, oh, Lord, you've given this monk a large family. This tradition has been carried on. And God has given Swamiji a large family. And we are all a part of it to the extent that we allow ourselves to be part of it. But we must live in that family, live in that spirit. Each of us has some stories, moments that we might associate with Swamiji's life. I'm going to tell a story that tells a lot about who Swamiji Kriyananda was as a person that was related to my life. And when I came to Ananda, I was a Kriyaban already, but I was a wild and crazy Kriyaban. I was, young and arrogant and thought that I knew a lot and used to getting my own way in life. But I also had the softer side, and I was sincere. And I very much knew that Master was my guru. And when I came to Ananda, I knew that this was my family. But quite clearly, not everybody else knew that this was my family. And so in those days, if you wanted to become a member of Ananda, you had to be there for at least a month. And then if you were accepted as a member, you were accepted for a year as a potential member. And only at the end of that year would you actually become an official member. And so after 1 month, which was the minimum amount of time, I applied for membership. I mean, it was quite clear to me I was home. And so there was a membership committee, and Swamiji was on the membership committee. And the people on the membership committee, there was 6 or 7 of the well-respected members. And it was clear to everybody that they were in training to be the membership committee. So basically it was up to Swami who would be a member, who wasn't. But they were there to learn how to attune themselves so that they could eventually take this over. And that did eventually happen. But at this meeting I came and they asked me a few questions on what I wanted to do, why I was there, and I told them I wanted to be a member, and I don't remember what I said. And then they told me to go outside and wait. They were going to discuss and vote. And of course, I was outside going, oh no, Om Guru, and praying that they were going to take me. And so I came back in, and sure enough, they took me. And I didn't find out the story for about 10 or 12 years. I found out what had taken place during that discussion. And basically, 80% of the people in that group didn't want to let me in. There was just something about me that they didn't like. And Swamiji agreed with them. Every disciple, when you hear the story about how they become a disciple and they arrive at the ashram, and the story is that the master's waiting with open arms, and it's like, oh, you've come, my beloved. For me, it was like the total opposite. It's like, we don't even want this guy around. But something happened in that meeting. Something happened, and Swamiji said he was sitting there, he's looking around, trying to decide what to do, leaning towards no. And he saw the face of one of the girls in that group. And he had noticed that she was kind of looking at me funny. That she had some intention toward me, some interest in me. And he saw that, and because of that, to serve her, in spite of all the no's, he said yes. And I later married that woman. In spite of all the no's, not to serve me, that's humbling, but to serve her, because she was his friend, because he cared about her. He took me on. And because he took me on in that moment, he said consciously, I'm going to help him. And later I wrote in a book this story, and I said, and Swamiji said, consciously, with intent, he was going to help me. And I believe because he did that, because he made that conscious intent, he did help me more than the average person that came. He gave me more attention. And later, when I heard the story from him, and then later, and I said, I think that he read it, that I wrote it that way in the book, and he said, yes, that's true. And so, of course, I know that God was pulling strings. And it's humbling to be the guy that, not only was he not wanted, I wasn't not just not greeted, but it's like, this fellow's distasteful. So my point is that it doesn't matter where we start. It didn't even matter if they'd said no. All I had to do was keep coming back. Eventually they would give it up, or I would change in a way that pleased them. But we have to stand up for our discipleship. And because Swamiji had conscious intent, and then you recognize that he had conscious intent, this whole Sangha was God's conscious intent through his life. And because he did that and dedicated himself to it with unrelenting vigor, with a body that didn't cooperate with him, but he just never gave up. He never slowed down. He just pushed and pushed and pushed. And because of that, we all have a Sangha that represents the intent of the Masters, the intent of that simple conversation between Jesus Christ and Babaji. And they said, let's send someone to the West. And then and then they predicted that the Americans would make these teachings practical. And this is what Swamiji's done. He's made them practical and created a whole lifestyle that allows us, no matter where we are, whether how restless we are, how involved in our responsibilities we are, whatever our lives look like, there is a way for us to connect to and to grow in our relationship with God and Guru. The Sangha makes no judgments or demands about where we start. It just says, let us all participate together and see if we can help each other. This is what the Sangha is. So, personally, I'm so incredibly thankful to this woman for having good eyes towards me. But then I look and I see Swamiji, because he did that, allowed me into his world. And I have had the opportunity, certainly there are a number of people that have spent more time with Swamiji, but relative to the number of people in the Sangha, not that many. Over the years, I've had more than my share. And because of that, I've observed over a long period of time how he has changed, how his expression of his discipleship matured over the years. In principle, it was always the same. But in the beginning, he tried to hide it. He thought, no, don't let anybody see how I really feel inside. But because I was around him, I began to see those times when there was a time when I saw him walk out of his meditation room. And the teaching is that the eyes are the doorway to the soul. So we had learned to look into his eyes, to see his consciousness through his eyes. And when you look into the pictures of Master, you just, as Swamiji said, it's like looking into eternity. Well, I saw his eyes. He walked out of his meditation room, and I saw the light shining in his eyes, and then I saw it like a filter come over him, and it was like he went, and he calmed himself. He drew himself down into his personality, which was just friendly and calm. You know, all the years I've known Swamiji, I've never seen him restless. You know how people go, you know, they twiddle their thumbs, they're moving their legs, they're doing some signs of restlessness. I've never, ever seen him do that. He's always been calm. He's always just been centered and at peace in himself. But over the years, his demeanor changed in the sense that that hidden relationship that he had with God, that he kept to himself, began to percolate out more and more. I mean, clearly we always felt magnetism, but there was something over the years, he stopped, either he decided, and I don't know the answer to this, either he decided that he was supposed to let more out, or he didn't have any choice. It just bubbled, which I tend to think. I think that there was a point at which I hadn't seen him for some time, and when I saw him again, I don't know what it, you know, whether he had some personal point where it changed or was just gradual, but I realized that it was no longer hidden. And then from about, well, it was probably somewhere around 2000 and the early 2000s, I would say. There was a point which I hadn't seen him, and then I saw him, and it was like he was radiating more in a way that he hadn't shown before. And then in the last 10 or 12 years of his life, it's just gotten, it got more and more and more. And, you know, he finally had to sort of admit that something was going on. He said, sometimes the joy is just, I can't hardly contain it. I don't know how I can stand it. And so he wasn't doing these samadhis. You know, we used to speculate, well, he has a pacemaker. He can't stop his heart. We always talk about, well, you go into breathless state and your heart stops and you expand into infinite samadhi consciousness. But as a practical matter, his body wouldn't let him do that. But he was experiencing this inner upwelling of joy that sometimes would just overwhelm him. And by sharing that, by helping us to realize that our spiritual experience and our discipleship doesn't have to be fantastic. It can just be peace. It can just be calmness. It can just be joy. And the more time we give to the spiritual life, and if as you meet more and more in the coming years of the acharyas from America, many of which you've met already, you realize that there's something underneath that is continuing, that is caring. And it's certainly my belief and hope that now that Swamiji has passed, that will, you know, when a great light is shining, smaller lights don't look as bright. But now that Swamiji's not here, it'll be easier to see that us little disciples can represent this larger reality in a useful way. But that because we are who we are, we have to share the responsibility. That we have to draw together more as a family, that we have to support each other. That we have to not take it for granted, oh, this person over there is taking charge of that. Let us all look at our lives and say, how can I look at the life of Swami Kriyananda and take his example, take his inspiration, take his vibration, take your connection, whatever that may be, and grow it. Because the only limit to our connection to God through the channels that have been sent to us is our interest and our participation. Namaste.